In May 2020, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company shared its plans to invest in building an advanced semiconductor manufacturing fabrication site, or fab, in Phoenix, Arizona. In December 2022, the company announced its commitment to build a second fab in Phoenix. Earlier this year, the U.S. Department of Commerce announced that they will allocate $6.6 billion to directly fund TSMC's third fab in Phoenix, producing the most advanced leading-edge semiconductors in the U.S., bringing TSMC's total investment in Arizona to over $65 billion. In early August, TSMC broke ground on its first facility in Europe, an $11 billion fabrication plant in Dresden, Germany. In this episode, we plan to discover why every advanced economy seems to be vying for a TSMC fab in their backyard, and how a small island country on the outskirts of the Pacific Ocean became the center of attention on the world stage. I'm your host, Joey Chou, and this is Beyond the Reefs. Hi, you're listening to Beyond the Reefs, a show produced by Radio Taiwan International. Here we talk about socioeconomic issues that are faced by Taiwan and their broader impact around the world, beyond the reefs of this island nation. Taiwan is known for many things: boba tea, bicycles, and semiconductors. In the next few episodes, we'll tackle each and every one of them, discover the history of each industry and how they came to be. But today, let's talk about the $150 billion industry, semiconductor chips. TSMC's third fab in Phoenix, Arizona is funded by the CHIPS Act. The CHIPS Act, for the uninitiated, is an abbreviation for the Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors and Science Act. It's meant to encourage bringing microchip manufacturing back to the U.S. after several decades of individual companies offshoring its technology. The primary objective is to strengthen the American supply chain for what is a vital component in most consumer electronics, from smartphones and cars to banks, ATMs, trains, and medical equipments. The CHIPS Act was signed into law in mid-2022 and authorized roughly $280 billion in funding. If it's hard to conceive of how much money that is, for a little perspective, that's like throwing the entire economy of Portugal in 2023, which had a GDP of approximately $287 billion, into building this one industry in the US. On the other hand, TSMC's fab in Dresden, Germany, called ESMC, which stands for European Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, is funded by Germany and approved by the European Commission under state aid rules, which stipulates that a company receiving government support gains an advantage over its competitors. Therefore, the treaty generally prohibits state aid unless it is justified by reasons of general economic development. To ensure that this prohibition is respected and exemptions are applied equally across the European Union, the European Commission is in charge of ensuring that state aid complies with EU rules. And in this case, the Dresden facility is tasked to meet the semiconductor needs of the entire European automotive and industrial sectors. Its partners are Bosch and Infineon, Germany's biggest engineering and technology company and semiconductor manufacturer. But why do they need Taiwan to spearhead these projects? First, let's try to understand just how significant a role that Taiwan plays.
TSMC, the global leader at the moment, basically focuses most of its manufacturing close to its home and operates absolutely massive plants with huge output.
When the company was founded in 1987, it had a really unique business model. It would only manufacture chips, not design any in-house. And that business model let it serve a wide variety of customers, companies like Apple or NVIDIA. And as a result, it's grown far larger than any other chip maker of its kind. And because of its scale, it's been able to drive down costs, but also hone its technology, because for every silicon wafer it produces, it gathers data, hones its production processes. And so it's not a coincidence that TSMC is both the world's largest chip maker, it's also the world's advanced chip maker.
Should we have 92% of all semiconductors in Taiwan? Maybe not such a good idea. That's an incredible vulnerability, and it really makes you stop and think, how did we get to a place where countries and companies thought that this was okay? You know, I think a lot about what would happen in this country and around the world if there were to be a blockade of Taiwan, if there were to be a hot war in the South China Seas. The only near-term comparison we have to something like this is the war in Ukraine. That created a global market event. We had inflation, we had huge corrections, we had, both in companies and countries. An interruption of the supply chains, not just in chips, but in everything through the South China Seas would be 1,000 times that.
This is a bad day for President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party. The slumbering giant that is America has finally awakened to the challenge that we face from the People's Republic of China, their aggressive posture in the region, and the potential they would have of cutting off our access to advanced semiconductors.
Another day of unpredictable Chinese drills around Taiwan this morning, simulating sealing off this self-governed island. Taiwan says dozens of Chinese warplanes once again crossed the very sensitive de facto maritime border of the Taiwan Strait.
Over the past decade, Chinese military power in the Taiwan Straits has grown dramatically as China's ramped up its military spending and focused almost all of its military efforts on threatening Taiwan.
Imagine what would happen today if instead of an oil embargo like we had in the 1970s, there was a chip embargo.
If the economy collapses, and if there are large interruptions in everyday life and the functioning of society, you could essentially expect production lines across the world to just stop.
The global paradigm is changing, and that creates bumps, and that can create conflict. And there is a real risk at this moment that an economic competition that is manageable could turn into something bigger and hotter and unmanageable, and that really does worry me.
What if China in some way got control of Taiwan? It doesn't have to be an invasion, but a much lower budget approach would be to make sure that the right folks won the next Taiwanese election. And what happens if the Taiwanese government says to the US, thanks a lot, you can go now? Conflict need not be military conflict, and that's a point that gets lost. We have a chance to manage that conflict using things like export controls, using things like industrial policy, but conflict is inevitable. And that's where the semiconductor industry and the CHIPS Act come in.
Here in Taiwan, we call TSMC 护国神山, which is literally translated into the mountain that guards the nation. It's a term that was originally used to describe the central mountain range that runs vertically down the island country, which breaks up typhoons during the tropical storm seasons. But in recent years, this term has been used to describe TSMC's influence on the Taiwan Stock Exchange and how its significance on the global stage is what incentivizes ally nations to shield us from geopolitical tensions. For reference, the Magnificent Seven in the US, Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, Google's Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, and Tesla make up approximately 30% of the entire US stock market, the S&P 500 index, which is quite significant considering how big the US economy is. But that's 7 companies. TSMC alone makes up 37% of the entire Taiwan Stock Exchange, compared to Samsung, South Korea's biggest company, which only takes up 30% of the Kospi. Imagine that one company's rise and fall will basically manifest and determine how well or poorly the entire economy performs. And the last few years have seen Meta and Tesla's market cap fallen, and in terms of the leading publicly traded companies in the world, their rankings are being caught up by companies such as Saudi Aramco, which is the majority state-owned petroleum and natural gas company of Saudi Arabia, and guess what? TSMC at number 8 on the US Stock Exchange. TSMC also dominates 50 to 60% of the global chips manufacturing market, a figure that skyrockets to over 90% when focusing on consumer electronics like iPhones and AI chips. It's the world's largest foundry, which is the industry term for contract manufacturing of semiconductors. Many semiconductor companies outsource the manufacturing of their chips to TSMC or Taiwan in general. Today, we'll be speaking with Edward Atkinson, who spent 23 years in Taiwan, mostly in the semiconductor industry. He was approached and hired to help with the TSMC project in Arizona until recently. We first asked him about the significance of Taiwan's semiconductor industry.
Hello, I'm Edward Atkinson. Grew up, went to school in Florida, then went in the military. So I was all over the place, basically, when I was in the military. But originally, I was from Florida. I spent 23 years in Taiwan. Part of that was in the military, doing aircraft-related items. When you guys were buying the F-16s, I helped construct the jet engine test facility in Gansan at the Air Force Academy for testing the aircraft engines. Been to every base, every Air Force base anyway, in Taiwan. Jiayi, Hualien, Taichung, and then switched to the semiconductor industry, which was the majority of the time while I was in Taiwan. Then I just stayed on doing semiconductor things in Taiwan. And actually, Fengshuan, which is Market Tech, they were my vendor before. I was utilizing them to sell things. And that's how I had a relationship with Margaret Gao, the chairman of Market Tech, which is Fengshuan in Chinese. Because COVID had hit, Margaret had asked me about coming here to help with this TSMC project. I specialize specifically in the process tools that actually touch and manufacture the wafers. That's what I was responsible for, was making sure that those tools got all their connections, all the wire connections, all the piping connections correctly to each type of tool cost effectively. That started out at about I think the total project for that was around $85,000. But with the various changes that occurred, it ended up being about $120 million to do all of the process tool connections. The semiconductor chip process is vital and very important. Everything has electronics in it. Automotive needs a lot of chips. There's over 80 modules within a car now just to make the car run, right? That requires a lot of automotive chips. So Taiwan is very important to this part. They have the most advanced factories in the world, the most advanced engineers in the world in this process, and cannot be bypassed. Oh, not just TSMC. You have PowerChip, you have UMC, you have Micronics. There's other factories that are manufacturing process chips for the world in Taiwan. And then you have all the probe and testing companies there and the back-end packaging as well. That's why it's vital to the whole world is Taiwan. If you can help the U.S. market, that's fine. They're sorely lacking in engineers and in the experience that Taiwan has. The political things is what's driving all this hurry up and move some factories to the U.S. But the U.S. is the consumer. It's never going to help. To build the factory here doesn't help. They don't have the right skill sets because we gave that up back in the mid-90s when they moved all this production overseas. You know, and it's not just Taiwan. It was Singapore, China, and then Israel. Europe was a big chip manufacturing as well. In France, in Italy, Ireland had chip factories. So Europe kind of went away. You know, Taiwan really took the lead and drove that forward. And, you know, hats off to Taiwan for doing that.
In terms of the 5 biggest semiconductor chips manufacturers in the world, number 1 is TSMC, which takes up, again, like we said, about 60% of the world's semiconductor chips manufactured. At second place is Samsung, which takes up about 11%. At third place is SMIC, a Chinese company, takes up about 5.2%. At number 4 is once again a Taiwanese company called UMC, taking up about 5.4%. And at number 5 is Global Foundries, an American company, taking up about 5.8%. In the late 60s and early 70s, the Taiwanese government started to pour a lot of resources into researching semiconductor manufacturing technologies and nurturing a whole generation of STEM professionals. That's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. There were reports of over 30,000 engineers in Taiwan by 1970s, and that is quite a lot in that time frame. Both TSMC and UMC were actually originally founded by the Executive Yuan's incubator program with Industrial Technology Research Institute, also known as ITRI, a nonprofit technology research and development institution in Taiwan. ITRI has been a main driver of Taiwan's economy in terms of research and development. There are a lot of companies that support the development of industry leaders such as TSMC and UMC here in Taiwan. For this semiconductor manufacturing machine to run well, many cogs need to work together in unison. So here's Edward again to talk about his involvement in the TSMC project and how Taiwan does its things.
I'm a master black belt in Six Sigma quality. So when the TSMC project came about in Arizona, I was approached to help with this project. So that's why I left Taiwan and came to Arizona. So I helped set up the off-site construction and some of the things in the warehouse to set up the material to go to the job site. Then I was asked to do the interconnect, which is all of the tool hookup parts. So all the process tools that are in the factory, I was director of that division, and I was there to hook up all the parts. In Taiwan, the vendors build the fabs. You know, they have a system in place of how it's done. And that's how all the vendors do this. It's based on a pattern system. You look at a drawing and the first part is called X1. Then you go all the way through to, like, say, X12. They actually quote how much it would cost to put in this pattern. They get the order, they go do that pattern, then they turn that in that they've completed the work. Then an engineer would go check it and validate, yes, it's done. And that's how they get paid. So based on the number of patterns that you do, that's how much work you get. That's how you progress or get larger as a supplier, because you can do more work and more patterns for TSMC, which is a really good system, by the way. With this TSMC project in Arizona, the TSMC Fab 21, which it's called in Arizona, is the first facility that TSMC built that utilized 3D modeling. What we're doing is the tools and the process is mimicking or copying from Fab 18. So when you set up the process here in Arizona, it has to match what they were doing in Fab 18. Fab 18 is in Tainan. Fab 21 is the one that's here in Phoenix, Arizona. The entire fab is called P1, but they split it into two sections, P1A, P1B. P1A is the only line that's partially running right now that they're making some process on. P1B tools have not been installed. P2 is being constructed, but it's just the shell right now. There's nothing completed on P2, and it's up for further discussion about the schedule for P2 because it was out of the realm of what TSMC normally does. The biggest problem was the people that have come here from TSMC, they don't build fabs. The TSMC engineers that are here were way too early. They're mainly tool guys, but they had brought people here too early. They were tasked with other things like CCTV cameras and wastewater treatment systems or warehouse. So they were utilizing people that don't really know those tasks to perform or to manage those tasks, and that caused a lot of the problems. They all tried their best, don't get me wrong. They worked as much overtime as possible. They really dedicated to get the job done. It would be the same as Taiwan's work style. It's a TSMC methodology. Some of them would go home and eat, take a shower, and go right back to work. So they were working long hours, trying to accomplish something, trying to show achievements that wasn't, in their realm to do that. Sometimes things would be installed and then taken right back out because something else had to be above it, as an example, right? So the synchronization of the project really failed. I actually helped build the factory down in Singapore, which is SSMC. That was a Philips TSMC joint venture. We didn't have this number of problems in Singapore. Basically, what I want to say, at the end of the day, Jiao Taiwan, just continue.
For both economic and political reasons, TSMC is very significant and it needs to continue doing what it does best. As the semiconductor manufacturing industry in Taiwan grows to near $150 billion by 2024, Taiwan continues to play a very significant role on that regard. Coming up next week, we'll continue to talk about some of the major industries here in Taiwan. I'm Joey Chou, and you've been listening to Beyond the Reefs.